In 1954, George Devol and Joseph Engelberger created the first industrial robot, a hydraulic arm that lifted heavy loads, which they called the Unimate. Maybe Unimate. I'm not sure. Welcome to the Final Girls podcast. I'm Anna Bogutska, your podcast host. I'm a critic, author of the book Feeding the Monster, and in this series of the Final Girls podcast, I'll be your guide through the intersections of horror and technology, from the first robots of the silent era to the most recent AI villains. Over the next few months, we will deep dive into machines. Every episode, I'll be joined by a guest to discuss a film or two and how it captures our fears and anxieties around technology and the place that it holds in our lives. In this episode, I'm joined by Fangoria writer and first-time podcast guest Amber T to discuss two films from 1954, made on opposite sides of the world, but which share a familiar DNA. In the aftermath of the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the threat of nuclear war has given way to the atomic age. And with it, the giant ants of them! And the giant fire-breathing monster of Godzilla. The first might be considered a relic, a B-movie with cheesy special effects, and the second has given way to one of the largest media franchises ever, with films continuously being released in cinema and Godzilla facing off many other enormously sized friends. But there's something fascinating about watching both original films side by side to see how the threat of nuclear disaster had penetrated both the American and the Japanese cultural psyche, and how horror served as the perfect place to explore it. If you enjoyed this episode, remember to subscribe and review the podcast wherever you listen to it, on Spotify or Apple Podcasts. And you can see what other films I'm going to be discussing over the next few months over on our Letterboxd page, which is linked in the show notes. You can always let me know your thoughts on the existential threat of nuclear annihilation by dropping me a line on hello@thefinalgirls.co.uk. And if you wish to support the podcast, you can do so on Patreon at patreon.com/thefinalgirls. And with all that said, please enjoy our conversation about them! And Godzilla! No! I think we're good. We're good to go. We're good to go to talk about some giant creatures.
That's the best thing to talk about.
I think it's the best thing to talk about any day. I think it's very appropriate for a Sunday afternoon. I think it's like some people like roast. I like a bit of Godzilla.
Yes. Honestly, these like old black and white movies, they're so Sunday afternoon. Like, that is the perfect way to describe them.
So, Amber, thank you so much for joining me. It's our first time recording, which is always lovely. And
yes,
thank you
so much for having me.
I wanted to ask you what I ask every single one of my first time guests. Can you tell me, what is your own personal relationship to horror?
Yeah, sure. So I am an only child, and I was a very anxious child growing up, like I was scared of everything. I was scared. I had this like lamp that looked like Mother Goose, and I used to have like nightmares about this lamp. I was terrified of everything. I used to have nightmares constantly. So I think when I became aware of horror as a genre, I was like, oh wow, I can actually enjoy this feeling and kind of have control over it, and kind of compartmentalize it into like this fictional space where I realized things weren't real and they weren't going to hurt me. My parents are big horror fans, and they would always like have these bootleg VHS tapes hanging around the house. And I remember watching, the classic, like I remember watching like Evil Dead very early and like The Shining, and going like having that fear come back, but also being kind of like enthralled by it and intrigued by it at the same time, and just feeling very, I don't know, more like more in control of those feelings. And I've always felt like horror has always, as it has for so many of us, it's always been there during like the darker parts of my life, and it gives you that space. It doesn't judge you. It's a genre that gives you that space to kind of lean in and explore those nasty and dark and sometimes violent feelings. And it never scolds you. It never attempts to curb them. It's just like, yeah, we're all fucked up here. Like, come and hang with us.
I love that. Also, I love the idea of like your parents sharing horror with you. I think that's so beautiful.
Yeah, a lot of it. I mean, my dad was very big into the old school sci-fi horrors that we'll kind of talk about later. And my mom's funny because she's very much, she wouldn't let me bring a DVD of The Ring into the house, but she loved, because she was like, no, that's cursed, get that out.
Very on point for this season.
Yeah, absolutely. But then she'll sit down and she'll be like, oh, hey, we're watching like this disgusting true crime documentary, just chilling out. So yeah, and she is like has full-blown anxiety as well. So I definitely got it from her. So I'm very much a product of my parents' taste in horror.
I love that. I'm an only child as well. And
amazing.
Contrary to that, I like horror was always like a private thing that my parents just never interacted with.
Oh, okay.
So it was very much like I could just get away with watching whatever I wanted because they would just not see what the horror films that I was watching were. They was like, oh, it's just a movie.
I feel like isn't that such an only child thing as well? Your parents trust you so much because they're like, oh, they're fine. They're in their own little world and they'll entertain themselves. Meanwhile, you're watching like the darkest shit ever. They're like, it's fine.
There's a very thin line between trust and negligence, but let's go with trust.
The only child mantra.
Yeah, exactly. Listen, it all worked out. We're here. We're talking about some great films. We're talking about, classic cinema, not even the nasty shit. Now they've been elevated.
We're normal. Look at us. We're normal.
So kind of getting into the thrust of the season that I'm doing now, which is all about technology and tech horror and machines going awry. What was the first piece of technology that you owned?
This is such a good question. I went on a full deep dive through my memories when you said it. So my family were not the richest family growing up, so I never had like all the top gadgets. But I do remember one Christmas, my granddad got me a Game Boy Pocket. It wasn't a Game Boy Color, and it wasn't like the big bulky Game Boy, but it was a smaller one. It was still black and white, and it was like yellow plastic casing. I was obsessed with this game. I literally I used to sleep with it in bed with me. I used to bite it.
Oh, okay.
I still have that, and you can see like my little
little bite marks.
Yeah, my little like 7-year-old teeth like grinding into it. Because I was really obsessed with Pokemon. So when I got that Game Boy Pocket and Pokemon, I was like, I love it so much, I just want to bite it. And it's like every time I see it, I'm like, oh, look at those little teeth. But yeah, I was complete. I remember being like so obsessed with the fact that I had this thing in my pocket that anytime I was bored or lonely or sad, I could pull it out and then I could have fun and I could like just disappear into this world of little Pokemon and, little creatures. And from there, I was like, I wanted all the games, consoles and all the games. I didn't often get them, but from there I was like obsessed with technology, and especially when the internet came around and I remember getting my first laptop, I was like, oh my god, it's over for me. I live online now.
I cannot get over the idea that you loved your little Game Boy so much that you wanted to literally eat it.
I loved it so much.
It's some Videodrome shit right there.
Literally, I was like, I need to have this Game Boy inside of me so I can play it through my stomach.
I want to see that movie. I really, really do.
And get David Cronenberg on the line.
Hell yeah. Or get Brandon. I think
yes!
Or Jane Schönbrunn. I think this sounds like their sort of tea.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Jane, come on. We're ready for you.
Listen, that is a perfect setup for what we're going to talk about possibly. But we're going to talk about them, ! And about Godzilla, both out in 1954. But I wanted to take a little bit of a wider lens first at where horror was in the 50s before these two giant atomic monster movies arrived on the scene.
Yeah, I often wonder, I think 50s horror kind of gets this almost like this bad rap for being like really cheesy and over the top, but actually the films we're talking about today are like very serious films. And I feel like in a lot of 50s horror, you can kind of definitely feel this anxiety of moving. You know, we're coming out of the Second World War and we're moving into the future. We've seen what happened in the war and the future's not looking bright. The future's very scary. So obviously in America, you get a lot of these sci-fi movies about otherworldly beings or mutants, and the monsters kind of change from the universal monsters like the Draculas or the werewolves, which are more humanoid in shape. And then you start to get, you know, things like them with insects and things like sea creatures, like, I don't know, things that feel colder and less human and more alien. And then in Japan, at least, 50s horror was kind of very concerned with spirits and ghosts and these kind of old folklore tales and these like jidaigeki period pieces like Ugetsu or like Yotsuya Kaidan. These kind of, I don't know, this kind of call back to the past and trying to like regain that old folklore. And you see like so much, what I love about this period of horror, I'm not hugely versed in 50s horror, but every time I watch it, I'm like, you can see them experimenting so much with like makeup and SFX and like new forms. And it feels like a really, I don't know, like a really creatively rich time.
It also feels like, I agree with you that I have the feeling that the 1950s get a bad rap in horror circles. Like they're either silly or there's nothing good, like nothing classically good coming out of that time. And I think it's a weirdly transitionary period. Like even when I was putting together this season, there was this huge jump basically from Metropolis in 1927 to like 2001 in the 60s.
Yeah.
Like that in-between period of the 30s, the 40s, and 50s are very concerned with more literary horror, particularly in the 30s. And then the 40s is a lot of women's pictures or gothic horror as well that are kind of adjacent to what we consider horror now. But in the 50s, they're no longer kind of adapting, or they've already adapted and readapted and satirized the classic horror monsters, and now they're creating new ones. And there's sort of these reactions to things around them, but in metaphor form.
Yes.
Yeah. And it's interesting that like there's both the sci-fi elements, so being into contact with aliens, being in contact with robots that are coming from outer space, traveling to other planets, other worlds, and then these like creatures that are weirdly formed or too big or too small, and it all has to do with like nuclear science or atomic science, these like really, really scary, large, very theoretical concepts of technology that are not as simple as here's a machine, here's a robot. They're more like physics gone awry.
Yes. Yeah.
And nobody can really get them, but we see the effects right there because they're huge and they're trying to stomp on us. And I must admit, I had not seen them, and I don't think I had seen the original Godzilla before prepping for the series. And I was really, really stunned how like how they're both having been made on opposite sides of the world and opposite sides of World War II as well, and the H-bomb, how they have not just a similar structure, but also quite a similar approach to the after effects of nuclear disaster.
Definitely. Yeah, it's and I always think, like we said before, that kind of cheesiness that people think. I think them specifically, people remember it as kind of a lot more silly than it actually was. But yeah, it's a very serious film, and it takes kind of the threat of, you know, an ant that literally lives under our feet every single day and blows it up into this kind of uncanny, bastardized version of something that we've grown too comfortable with. And I think, you know, there's so much there with the, you know, coming out of World War II and the Cold War. It's just both of them are really thematically rich, you know, classic movies for a reason.
So considering this is a season mostly focused on tech horror, do you see these two films as examples of tech horror? And how do you think technology is represented in both them and Godzilla?
I do see them definitely as tech horror. And I think the ending of them specifically, there's a quote that sums up what I think these two films are about. When they say, when man entered the atomic age, he opened a door into a new world. What we'll eventually find in that new world, nobody can predict. I think these are two films that they are obviously directly dealing with the aftermath of World War II, and specifically the aftermath of the nuclear bombs dropping on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the entire world, you know, humanity has kind of realized in 1954, oh shit, like how much damage this new technology could actually do, and being like completely and totally humbled by it. I think technology in these films, you know, you go from like the classic excuse me, the sci-fi stories of the 30s where technology is like this, oh wow, spaceships and we're going into the future, and then you get here and you're like, oh god, no, I don't want to do that, I don't want to go there anymore. And you know, it's kind of, I guess in Godzilla, the oxygen destroyer kind of sums it up really nicely. It's this moral dilemma between having this technological tool that can at once be really helpful, but at the same time it's hugely dangerous. And, you know, we see that today with like the internet and AI and everything. There's always this kind of, humanity is constantly trying to deal with this balance of taking it too far and kind of reckoning with the fact that we can never really control this kind of technology. And I think that's, you know, there's a daunting, overwhelming feeling in both of these films that I think they both sum up really nicely.
And what do you think, let me rephrase, what would you say is the general framework of a nuclear monster movie like them and Godzilla? Do you think that these two films originated that framework both in Hollywood and in Japanese cinema?
I would say definitely. I mean, like I said, I'm not hugely versed with 1950s horror, so there may well have been, you know, a little underground thing that I'm missing before. But especially in Japan, this was the first monster movie in Japan. Like I said before, Japanese cinema had been kind of dealing with ghosts and spirits and more grounded situations. Japan has a really interesting relationship with the dead and the underworld, so ghosts are kind of less alien than they are in Western horror. But in the 1950s, you know, you're coming out of World War II, but it's not a particularly happy time. There's a lot of paranoia and global distrust. And I think you see that in these monster movies in the framework where this, usually something quite mundane, like an ant or a lizard, is escalated into this giant threat. And most of the film is kind of dealing with people trying to figure out, okay, what is it? How do we defeat it? Let's try this. That failed. Let's try this. And I think when people talk about monster movies, these two films in particular, I think, are less about the monster, but more about like the processes behind figuring out what it is. You know, these are films that are very focused on their human characters. And, you know, I always look at like Letterboxd after I watch something again, and like a lot of the comments in them are like, oh, you barely see the ants. So it's like, well, you'd see them a fair bit, but it's also like, it's not all about the ants, really.
No, I think you're absolutely spot on. And this was a thing that also surprised me, actually, about both films, is that there's not that much time actually spent on the monsters.
Mm-hmm.
I think that might be how kind of the monster movie, or particularly the Godzilla franchise, has evolved into just spending a lot of time with the enormity of the creature and the destruction they see. But really, this is these are films about processes. This is a lot about authorities, about the army, about the police, about journalists, about like the government and scientists, all trying to figure out how to deal with a big, huge thing that nobody understands.
Mm-hmm. Very much so. Yeah, there's a bureaucracy in these films that I always find very funny. And specifically, there's a great bit in them where I forget his name, Dr. Medford, I think. But Dr. Medford is like trying to figure out how to do the call over the radio. Yeah. And he's like, why do I have to say over? She knows it's me. And I'm like, isn't that so like spot on for these silly processes that, the world's being attacked by giant ants and you're caring about the paperwork. It's a very, very human thing at the heart of it there.
But I think it was also really an interesting dynamic between the authorities. So like the scientist, Dr. Medford, and his daughter, Dr. Medford, in them, and also Dr. Serizawa, is it? And Dr. Yamane in Godzilla, where they don't want to kill the monsters. They want to study them because they're fascinating to them and kind of the only ones of their kind that they can discover. They're treating them as discoveries. But the government is like, no, kill it now. Kill it with fire, kill it with water, whatever it takes. And I loved in them how actually I wanted to hear what you thought, whether you felt like the film, considering the context in which it was made, whether it was kind of like a subtly anti-government film or whether it was very pro-government, because there was so much silencing of people very openly in that film.
Yeah, I think both of these films actually really occupy this really interesting space where I think they both are kind of pro and anti-government. Especially, like, I don't know, like you said, in them, there's these scenes where we're like, we can't let the people know what's going on. And a lot of silencing of, scientists. And, oh my God, how relevant is that, like, still today, where people are just not listening to the scientific experts and they're instead listening to, like, these meatheads in charge who don't have a clue and don't know anything. But yeah, Godzilla is an especially interesting one because... yes, we do want the scientists' take on it, but and I know this is kind of a thing a lot of people have an issue with Godzilla, is that it feels quite nationalistic in a way, and it's kind of, and especially I think the later ones. I know Godzilla -1 was there was a bit of contention there because it reads quite the Japanese government are saving the day and all we need is to like remilitarize and we'll take down the threat. So I think that one specifically kind of it has this interesting space where you're at once distrusting of the government and then at the same time like, oh, well, do we really have a choice at this point?
I think that's really interesting. I definitely want to hear about how you think the Godzilla franchise has evolved from this original film, because the 1954 film that we're talking about is, first of all, absolutely stunningly shot, like just really, really gorgeously made, and really feels like a war drama as opposed to a giant monster movie. Yes, there's a giant monster, but it's very much said, even in the text of the film, that this is essentially a creation sorry, let me rephrase that in a better way. This is essentially a creation because of the H-bomb, and like Godzilla is like a living version of the bomb that is seeping the same kind of destruction over the city. And it's interesting to me how the authority element, they are all stumbling and staggering and don't know how to deal with it. And in the Japanese one, in the American one, the public isn't really involved, but there's a really interesting scene in the Godzilla film where there's like a public forum where there's a conversation about like, no, the public needs to know.
Yes.
Or does it. And I was wondering, how do you think that that's portrayed within the context of Japanese cinema specifically?
I think there's something really interesting about these two films that I was thinking about in regards to the monsters specifically, and how so Japan in general is a collectivist society versus America, which is a more individualist society. So I think it's very interesting how in them the threat is this kind of, you know, this nest of ants, these very many mindless drones, whereas in Godzilla the threat is one big thing. So it's almost like both countries have taken their opposite framework of society and placed it into a giant threat. Japan is very much a country where it's encouraged that you care about, you know, your fellow Japanese people. And, you know, it's very much, I'm not an expert, of course I lived there for some years, but I'm not Japanese, so I don't want to speak like too much on the cultural framework. But there is much more of a sense of collectivism, and there's also much more of a sense that the government is kind of, they owe you. You know, there's Japanese people won't hesitate to assassinate their leaders if they've had enough of them, you know, which maybe some other countries could learn from. But yeah, that's all I'll say on that. But there's very much a sense of, like, I don't know, like the many versus the few, and that if Japanese people can combine together, they are the ones that are in power and not the people at the top. They are the ones that should be serving, the civilians.
And how do you think about the way that, again, because these are parallel figures in both of the films, how are the scientists portrayed in both films?
I think they're very much a product of their time, specifically in them. There's that great scene where Dr. Medford, female Dr. Medford, is like, if you don't want to call me doctor, just call me Pat, or whatever her name is. So I think that's a nice little comment on how we were seeing, women in power at the time. But I think in general, they both see the scientists as the people that we should be listening to. And I guess Dr. Serizawa in Godzilla is a particularly an interesting character, because obviously he sacrifices himself he sacrifices himself for Japan, and he is the one that kind of has this, I guess he's kind of like an Oppenheimer figure in a way, where he does create this weapon of mass destruction, but he has this huge moral dilemma about whether to use it. But unlike Oppenheimer, he doesn't let people use it. So I think that's kind of a not so subtle dig at Robert Oppenheimer from Ishiro Honda.
I know. I also appreciated that. It's almost like this is what you should do when you discover something that is so big that there is no, if you cannot foresee it being used for positive effects for humanity, and it can only be used as a super weapon, destroy it. It's like, I think it kind of quite maybe not so subtly investigates the responsibility of scientists who are making these discoveries as well. And it's quite poetic at the end that it's one weapon of mass destruction that destroys another, or I should say kind of neutralizes another. But I was wondering as well, how you think the death of the monster, how do you think both films treat the death of the monster? Because I was quite moved by the fact that in Godzilla is mourned by the people. Like, people are sad that he's gone.
Definitely. I always find the endings fascinating, because the ending of them, the ending of Godzilla feels, like you said, it feels very mournful in a way. You know, Japan is a representation of what happens after the bomb. So he's kind of, at this point, the Japanese people had seen what the bomb did. They didn't need it. They didn't need to imagine it. It was a real situation. So, and Godzilla in himself is a product of the bomb. He didn't ask to be awoken from his sleep. He didn't ask to, his character change by this nuclear outburst. So I think a lot of, Japanese society at this time probably saw him as both a victim and a villain, which is very much where Japan stood at this time. Japan committed some of the most horrific war crimes in World War II, up there, if not worse than Nazi Germany. But the bombs were devastated innocent civilians. Like these people who had their lives completely turned into like melted ash and wasteland, they had nothing to do with it. So at this point in history, Japan does occupy that very interesting space where they are both victim and villain. So I think they don't see Godzilla as a purely mindless, terrifying threat. There's there's very much an empathy and a sympathy for him there. And like you said, the ending is really mournful, and everyone, you know, kind of takes their hat off and feels bad for him. But in them, we end on this fiery, explosive note where we don't even get this cathartic ending. We get this horrible kind of premonition that it's not over yet, and it's very ominous. So I think they both have a really interesting attitude towards the end of the war, if the war, you know, representing these films, where America was like, it's not over yet, and Japan was like, we can't do anymore, it's over for us.
I think that's so fascinating, and especially if we're being like really crude about it, in them, what they do is kill the ants' babies, because they kill the queen ant, and then they discover the eggs that have hatched 4 enormous ant babies, and they just full on like set fire to them.
Yeah.
I mean, it
just made me sad.
It's really sad. It's really bad.
It is, and I think that kind of, you know, again, not to get too simplistic about it, but that kind of, to me, sums up the difference between America and Japan in both of these films, where the Japanese urge when they discover Godzilla is to study him and kind of find out about him, and then killing him is kind of, it is something that they want throughout, but it's not something to be celebrated. Whereas in them, the first instinct is, all right, kill it, burn them all. Yeah. And babies.
Fucking hell. But I wonder as well, do you think it's meaningful that in Godzilla is like awoken by the H-bomb, versus in them where, you know, something very small and very pedestrian and very disempowered, really. I mean, you know, it's not go too far and give ants and spiders too much power, but like something that is very recognizable in our everyday is transformed by nuclear energy, whereas Godzilla is something ancient, something that is older than you know, the war, older than the bomb, something that was disturbed by a human act, by this massive piece of technology.
Yeah, I think that's, you know, that's quite, that goes back to a lot of Japanese culture and folklore, where Japan does have this relationship with what we call kami, so like different gods that occupy different spaces, and everything has a god. So it's not, you know, it's not beyond the realms of possibility that a Japanese person at this time would, you know, they would see Godzilla as perhaps a god that had been awoken from like a deep slumber. But again, I think it goes back to that kind of feeling that this is not Godzilla's fault. He is just as much a victim as the people who suffered when the bomb was dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. He didn't ask for it. He was innocently slumbering away, just going about his daily life, when suddenly this thing that is completely out of his control is dropped on him and rises him up from the depths. And we're kind of seeing, the whole film is basically Godzilla trying to like deal with that and kind of rampaging. He's confused, he's lost, he's scared. He just wants to go back, you know, back. I know, it's sad. I'm getting sad thinking about it. And I really get sad in Godzilla films where they shoot him, because I know they have to, but I'm like, leave him alone, please. He doesn't understand. He just wants to go back to sleep under the sea. And I think, yeah, that's a really interesting reflection of where Japan was at this time, and these people in these cities. They didn't ask to be bombed. There's a really sad, I was reading up like testimonies from they're called hibakusha, which is like the people who survived the bomb, and one of them was this little girl who was like, why do Americans hate me? I didn't do anything, like why have they done this to me? And yeah, I think it's really sad. It's and it kind of contrasts very interestingly to the American way of looking at them, where they are a threat that's, you know, that's come out of nowhere and is intent on one thing. There's not a lot of nuance there.
I think that's also quite interesting how both films use children, like as the, the very first shot of them is like this kind of shell-shocked little girl walking around in the desert. And in Godzilla, there's these terrifying shots of children and their mother telling them, it's like, oh, we're going to go meet daddy where he is. It's horrendous. And I wonder, I mean, it's obvious the difference in terms of how both countries experienced World War II. And how do you think this fear of another nuclear disaster is represented in kind of the American nuclear monsters films versus in Japanese cinema like Godzilla?
I think it's really interesting how in a lot of American cinema and kind of culture and comic book culture and things like that, this nuclear disaster or exposure to radiation is not always a good thing, but it's a transformative thing. A lot of the superheroes like Spider-Man and Hulk and possibly many more, I'm not very well versed with superheroes, but they're exposed to radiation and they end up with powers that are mostly good for them. If not good for them, they use them in a way that is good, for the country or the world. Whereas in Japanese cinema, it's very much a harbinger of doom and destruction, and it's something to very much be avoided. I did see the first American, is it 1998? The first American one.
Well, I think the American Godzilla.
Yes.
Well, the first one was 1956. It was essentially a re-edited, kind of Americanized version of Godzilla.
Oh yes, the King of the
Monsters! Exclamation mark!
Yes. Yes, yes, absolutely. But I remember watching the later ones, the newer ones, and I don't know, I just can't remember anything about them. And Godzilla and Godzilla versus Kong and these newer ones, I find them hard to connect with on kind of an emotional level. They're very much all spectacle, I guess. It's Godzilla running around smashing buildings. It doesn't really feel like there's any weight to him or any heft to him. So I find it interesting how the American focus on his story is he's a big scary monster rather than the Japanese focus, which was originally, yes, he's a big scary monster, but there's a lot more to him than that.
Yeah, I remember going to see the 1998 American Godzilla in the cinema, and there's this really, I think they even used it on the poster, it's just this enormous paw that's stepping on a car, right? And it's all very impressive. It's obviously very influenced by Jurassic Park and kind of what Spielberg did with that, like these enormous kind of dinosaurous creatures. But again, I remember nothing, mostly the paw. But what I found super moving about the 1954 original Godzilla is that it is about the devastation. And the devastation is not about Godzilla rampaging. It's about, well, now this bridge is ruined. Now this entire town is on fire. These houses are broken. And it showed us people, sure, extras, like not really characters that are fully fledged, but it showed us so many people that were running for their lives, that were scared, that were terrified, that were, kind of staying in their positions, ready to accept death. And just as it never loses sight of the fact that it's more interested in the devastation that it wrecks on people rather than the monster. And it takes its sweet time to even show us Godzilla.
Yeah, I think he has he has a very small amount of screen time. And when you do see him, what always sticks out to me is compared to the American ones is the destruction that he wreaks feels so much more tangible because, like you said, you do see these, he's not that big in the original Godzilla, whereas in like the 2000s 2014 or whatever, he's massive. He's like the size of a god. Like, and you don't see, you lose that sense of scale where you don't see the people on the ground because he's so big. He's just whacking his tail through the buildings. There's no sense of like, you know, that scene of Godzilla just like picking up a train car is so scary because yes, it's not that big, but you can see the people inside it and you can imagine the fear that they must be going through.
No, I agree. And I mean, it's always a bit sniffy, I think, to talk about the special effects of films from the 50s because we're not seeing these films with the eyes of a 1954 audience. So they're always going to look kind of cheesy for us. But both of these films for the time had massively advanced special effects, and particularly Godzilla used a really innovative way to create the sense of scale for Godzilla himself.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember, you know, watching that, revisiting them as well for this one. I was like, oh my god, these things are actually scary. Like the puppets that they made, and I don't like. I know a lot of people say that like Godzilla 1954 is like goofy and he looks scary. I genuinely think he looks terrifying. Like I don't know. There's some like blankness in his eyes that really puts the chills down me because, as you said, that sense of scale is there with you know this remarkable suit that we'd never seen anything like it before. This rubber suit, and there's textures and you can feel the weight as he moves through the town, and it's really scary.
Do you know what it is for me? It's in them. It's the fact that the ant puppets are furry.
Yes,
they're fuzzy. You know when you see a spider up close and you see that it has fur and you're like, get it out my face now.
Yeah,
I cannot.
It's foul.
And the different their legs like move at different speeds, so I guess they're being puppeteered independently instead of just moving like one big block. Hate it. Don't like it. Get it away from me. Don't shoot it, but don't want it near.
Let it go away peacefully. No, I know what you mean, because I guess we think of ants as like smooth, but I don't know, when you get up that close to them, it kind of something about it makes me itch. I really don't like it.
Yeah, and obviously the sound is
so
amazing.
So good. I mean, both of these films use sound, like, you know, I guess in the absence of how much you could show these creatures on screen, they both, I remember Godzilla's roar still scares me. Like, I think that's terrifying.
I think like they really do achieve a sense of scale with the roar because it sounds like it's far away, but it's very loud. So you're like, what the hell is making that level of noise that I can hear it from like 500 kilometers away?
Exactly. And then you go, it feels realistic because it's loud, but it's not like, it is not window shattering, it's not earth shattering, but it's there, and it's kind of got this meaty depth to it that's just I guess it triggers that kind of that monkey brain in when you see like an alligator or a reptile and you're like, oh my god, I feel very feral and primal right now.
I think it's the same with Godzilla. Well, there's two things that really freak me out about Godzilla. On the one hand is the texture, like the costume. It's obviously like a sort of rubber costume, and a guy was in the costume and he was moving around the miniature set, which I think is very clever for the 50s. And it glistens, like it's this really beautiful black and white cinematography, and you just see the scales glistening as he's coming out from underwater. And I know we don't see it, but I imagine that he's also like covered in blood, which again just gives you the heebie-jeebies in a similar way. But the other thing that really freaked me out, and this can only be done if you've got a man in a suit, is that there's one point where he grabs a helicopter and his hand moves so quickly.
His hands are really scary. And there's some points where he's like clearly frustrated, and he rubs his temple, and I'm like, oh my god, he's mad. It's really scary.
I absolutely loved Godzilla. He's very sweet and he's very annoyed and he's very grumpy and obviously wreaks a lot of destruction, but none of it is his fault, I think, is what we're trying to get at.
Who among us hasn't done that? Who among us hasn't destroyed Tokyo when we're in a bad mood?
And I wonder, what do you think of the way, you sort of touched upon it a little bit earlier, but what do you think of the way that Godzilla, which has since that original film in 54, has evolved into one of the, if not the largest media franchise in Japan, hasn't it? Across films and different studios and different adaptations, and there's so many series and versions of it. How do you think Godzilla has evolved over the decades?
Oh, so much. You know, I'm not an expert in Godzilla movies or kaiju movies at all, but you don't need to be, I think, to just see his impact. He's everywhere. He's everywhere in Japan, and he's not only everywhere, but he's also cute. He's like a cute little guy. He's gone from this terrifying, which is kind of sad in a way. He's gone from representing the horrors of nuclear war to being like a little keychain that you put on your bag. But I always feel like that there is, I know a lot of the later Godzilla movies do get flack for kind of being cheesy and silly, and once you start getting into, like, I don't know, the bio-mecha Godzilla and baby Godzilla and son of Godzilla, but the more which, you know, I think they're cute too, but the more recent films like Hideki Anno's Shin Godzilla, which I think is one of my favorite Godzilla movies, it evolves the story to focus more on like the Fukushima nuclear incident of 2015, maybe. But it takes those same themes of nuclear destruction and brings it more into like a modern day Japanese setting. So I think we're kind of seeing a pivot back to Godzilla as more of a tangible threat. You know, Godzilla -1 that came out a couple of years ago, he was definitely... I don't want to say he's the bad guy in that, because I think it's more nuanced in that, but he's a threat. He's scary in that film. He's fucking scary in that. So I think, you know, we'll probably see, in the Japanese movies at least, we might see a new era of a Godzilla comeback era where he does represent the kind of darker things again.
And how do you think Japanese cinema, or horror especially, has tackled and explored the after effects of the bombings outside of Godzilla?
I mean, I genuinely believe that you can see the bombing in pretty much all Japanese horror in some way or another. I mean, it would be impossible not to. But, you know, a lot of cinema coming out of the Japanese New Wave in the 60s, you have a lot of filmmakers who served in the war and were present there. So a lot of their films, obviously, are dealing with changing politics and changing landscapes and kind of rebuilding your identity. You know, in horror, Japanese horror, you do see these films, like I mentioned, with Ugetsu and Onibaba or Kaidan, these kind of old tales where the bomb is not present in these tales at all in any narrative sense, but there is also a sense of kind of longing to go back to a Japanese pre-war past and kind of hold on to that identity that I think Japan was feeling like they were at risk of losing. And then you get to the J-horror boom of the 90s, and even with things like Ring and Ju-on, you see movies that focus on on grief and these cycles of destruction, where these ghosts like Sadako and Kayako, they are forced to live out these cycles of pain that's been inflicted on them. And a lot of those films have technological fears as well, you know, something like Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Pulse, where we're dealing with the internet, which is not specifically related to the bomb in any narrative sense, but you can still see those threads coming through.
Oh, I'm excited to cover that one later on in the series.
Oh, it's so, I mean, that's maybe one of my favorite horror films of all time. Like, just magnificent.
Oh yeah. And I know we've spoken a lot about Godzilla, and obviously that's kind of continued being reinvented, but where do you think them ! Sits in the public imagination? Or do you feel its fingerprints elsewhere in horror?
Yeah, and I think them is kind of one of those films where like I said before, I think people misremember it and they kind of put it in that camp with these cheesy B-movie films, but it's not really like that. You know, them influenced Ishiro Honda, the director of Godzilla, when he was making another of his kaiju films, Rodan. So it's really nice to see that kind of, you know, that influence of shared relationship between the two. And I think the general narrative structure of them and Godzilla can be seen in like any of the big monster movies or alien movies, you know, even something like Nope by Jordan Peele, where the plot is we find this big creature, and then the rest of the plot is this kind of series of trial and error experiments where we're trying to figure out what takes the monster down. So I think you can really see that kind of up and down style plot in a lot of monster movies. And I would honestly not be surprised if, you know, we're seeing this kind of monster renaissance at the moment with, you know, Nosferatu and Wolfman and the upcoming Frankenstein. I would not be hugely surprised if we saw like a nuclear monster renaissance.
Interesting.
I just think
please expand.
Well, I think we're at a very scary point in global politics. We're seeing like this. We've got a maniac in charge of America who could very much. We've got maniacs in charge everywhere, to be honest. You know, who are very much erratic when it comes to these wars. We've seen like this global shift to conservatism that I think is quite scary, and I think we will maybe see that reflected in this kind of sense of bigger monsters coming in, you know, the approaching other coming in from outside.
See, that's really interesting because I've noticed the kind of the return of the classic literary monsters, your Frankensteins, your vampire, your Dracula, Nosferatus, Wolfman. And I think we do that as a palate cleanser in between horror shedding one skin and getting another one. And I think we're in that period now. But what's interesting about what you're saying, and you're completely accurate, is that there are such overwhelming global fears. And I think we haven't fully yet processed how we dealt with COVID. And it's now been enough time where the stories that came out of COVID, the first wave of stories that came out in the post-COVID world, were a lot of self-isolation, a lot of being in a single place. Like even the Wolfman, you know, is a very COVID-influenced story where everything is set in one location that's very isolated from other people. But I think there's these very large global preoccupations and such distrust in governments around the world about how they're dealing with global threats like climate change, for instance, or a potential nuclear war, or kind of larger conflicts. So what if we have both the resurgence of the classic literary monsters and a new, you know, big giant nuclear monsters era, because we're worried about, you know, the wrong person pressing the wrong button and everything going to shit?
I mean, I can see it happening. I think that's really, you know, I love what you said there about distrust, because I think that does come down to a lot of especially them. Them is such a paranoid movie. And what I think is interesting about nuclear destruction as a theme is that it's a specifically modern theme, but it is something that, it should terrify everyone. You know, you can be scared. Some people are scared of ghosts and some people don't care, and some people are scared of vampires or whatever, but we all should be scared of, you know, just watch Threads for a bad time. We should all be very scared of, you know, the possibility of a nuclear winter upon us. So you know, this is a great time for horror filmmakers to take advantage of that.
I mean, we're finishing off on a high note, Amber.
Yay!
And to start wrapping us up, why do you think people should watch these films today?
Well, again, I think, like we just said, these are kind of they're very precedent films, and more so than that, both of these films were made by filmmakers who remembered the war, and Ishiro Honda definitely did serve in the war. I'm not sure about the director of them, but probably. So these films are direct warnings, you know, and it's that old phrase where, you know, if you don't remember history, you're doomed to repeat it. But aside from that, I think a lot of modern filmmakers could benefit from revisiting these films and could stand to learn a lot from pacing, and not fall into the trap of revealing too much too soon. That's something I noticed quite a lot. I'm not going to name them, obviously, because I want to keep the peace. But some films I've watched recently, I'm like, oh, you've shown me this now, and I don't care anymore. The mystery's gone. So I think, yeah, keeping that thing in the dark until you no longer can, and then just giving a little glimpse of it. In Jaws, you see the shark for like less than 2 minutes, and it's one of the scariest films of all time.
I love that. It's always showing just a little bit, it's a little bit of the knee, a little bit of the paw, a little bit of the scales, and then just one big boom, here's the monster.
Yes, and that works so much better. That works better.
Amber, I love this. Thank you so much for your time. Is there anything about either them or Godzilla that you wanted to mention that we haven't covered?
I would just I always say this when I talk about like an older film on a podcast. I would recommend anyone who, because I'm guilty of this, and I'm sure a lot of us are from a certain generation. I'm very guilty of seeing a film and seeing that it's in black and white and being like, oh, I don't want to watch that. I have ADHD. I need colors. But there is so much to learn from these old classic movies. Every time I visit something new from the 50s or even earlier, I'm always amazed by how precedent and how modern these films feel. So I would really say, if you haven't seen Godzilla, if you haven't seen them, I'm sure most people have seen Godzilla, but Them is I think it's a really underrated, great little movie, and I would highly recommend, even if you have a ADD rattled brain like I do, like sit with it and just let it wash over you, because it's very creepy.
Amber, thank you so much. And where can people find more of your work online?
So I am still on Twitter, sadly, at Hornbloodfire. So you can find me on there, and Instagram with the same @. I'm on Blue Sky at Blonde Kaidan, where I do post a lot of my writing. And obviously I have daily writing going up on Fangoria. I have some stuff coming out with 88 Films, with Second Sight, with TerraVision, and maybe some more stuff with Arrow in the pipeline. So yeah, just keep an eye on those socials, because I talk a lot online and you won't miss it.
I love it. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.